Today, June 25th, 2020, marks the 70th anniversary of the beginning of the Korean War. The Chester Public Library staff has compiled information to respectfully remember those who served in Korea during and after the war. And we are also including some who were called to service in other places during the 1950s. We know that all who serve from our community are not included in this presentation. If your service or the service of someone in your immediate family in the United States Armed Forces during this era is not included in this presentation, or you have more to add to the information we are sharing, we encourage you to share photos and additional information in the comments of this Facebook post. Sources for this presentation include back issues of the Randolph County Herald Tribune. Back then, the Herald Tribune was called the Chester Herald Tribune, and the Randolph County Illinois Veterans Book, compiled by the Randolph County Genealogical Society in 2003. And I especially would like to thank those who shared photos, stories, and memories from the personal collections of those who served. So let's get started. As you can see, we have bound copies of the Herald Tribune from the 1950s. So our search, as we began looking for information about the Korean War, began in mid-June of 1950. You can see the community was voting on consolidating the school district, and Harry Katz was our mayor. Kids were attending band camp in DuQuoin. I'll try to go a little bit slow as we go through these slides in case you want to read some of the headlines and other things on the screen. But we're also, like I said, going to give you a glimpse of what was happening at home. And you can see the Joy Theater and the Gem Theater had fun movies. You could go to the theater for anywhere from 12 to 35 cents back then. And Jackie Robinson was starring in his own story. A couple of ads from the 1950s. You could call the AG Market at phone 13. Or if you wanted free parking down at Uffelman Supermarket, you could park on the lot across the opposite City Hall on Chestnut Street. So that means at that time, our City Hall was at a block and a half down the road from us here at the library, close to the county courthouse. America's favorite pastime, baseball, was a big part of recreation at that time. The picture on the left of my screen is Earl Gene Runge playing sandlot baseball down in the Catholic Bowl. You can also see by the headlines the shoe factory people were having a fire drill on a warm July afternoon. It also talks a little bit about the census on this particular issue. Just like we're talking about the census here in 2020, the importance of it hasn't changed. I guess this is a good time for a gentle reminder. If you haven't completed your census, it's really something you should do. If you wrote a bad check in 1950, it might make the front page of the newspaper, like this one from July of 1950, or the sketch on the other page, on the other front page, also in July of 1950, shows a new business coming to Chester, a Tractor Supply business out on the edge of town. Most of you might recognize that building now as Reed's Harvest House. It wasn't until the July 28th, 1950 issue that we see Korea in part of the headlines. Of course, the war had already started. We know that it started on June 25th. But this photo shows Corporal Benjamin Parrish. He had been serving in Japan and is now, according to this article, heading to Korea. Now, Ben's sister and son were able to help us get some of his collectibles from that time period. You can see the original picture that was in the newspaper article, along with an envelope from when he sent a letter to his mother from Korea, we assume at this point. You also see medals he earned and the military payment certificate. I guess Ben did come home with $1 in his pocket. I don't know much about these military payments certificates, but it says, in case you can't read it, that it's for use only in the United States military establishments by United States authorized personnel in accordance with applicable rules and regulations. I'm looking up Ben's service record in the Veterans book that the Genealogical Society put together, and I'll just read a paragraph out of it. Ben had been in Japan for 18 months when the Korean War started on June 25th, 1950. He was put aboard an LST and landed at Busan in South Korea on July 1st, 1950, where, after learning to drive and getting his license in Japan, he was giving a truck driving job in transportation. He transported supplies and ammunition many times from one end of Korea to the other. After that, we start seeing more articles about those in service in Korea. Sergeant Roy Stewart in the Medical Corps on the Korean War front. I thought this was an interesting article, so I'll read a bit of it. Recent international news items have mentioned Sergeant Roy Stewart of Chester, a member of the Army Medical Corps. Mention was made in connection with a story concerning the attack on the Red Cross marked vehicles of the South Korean Army by North Korean forces. As the medics explained, the enemy expects no quarter and gives none. The Americans entered the Korean War with polished bright crosses on their ambulances and flags flying from their litter jeeps. The corpsmen who attended the wounded wore armbands of white on which was a large red cross, and they carried no weapons. The North Koreans showed no respect for the medical corps and in fact seemed to use the red crosses for targets. Said Sergeant Stewart, "We tried leaving red crosses on the roof for identification, but that just drew more fire. So we painted them out too. The Medical Corps has found it better to avoid marking any vehicles with red crosses." Another article shows a study from the University of Illinois about how the war is affecting the economy. And another article states that a boy from Marissa was killed in action and was the first casualty of the war. The first GI killed in action on the Korean front was Kenneth Shadrach, former Tilden coal miner. The Shadrachs now make their home in West Virginia. Young Shadrach is a nephew to Mrs. Martha Dykes and John Shadrach of Marissa. He was 17 when he entered the Army. He was the victim of a machine gun burst and is buried in a graveyard on the outskirts of Sojeon in South Korea. Another glimpse at home from the time. This is August of 1950. We can see their lake is born in Randolph County, and no, it's not the Randolph County Lake. It's the lake that behind Birchler Estates, or that we know as Birchler's Lake. Often in doing our research, we saw lots of information about polio and fundraising for polio and children and people affected by polio. And you can see at that time there was an ad in the paper from the Kahneman Agency offering insurance to protect you from expenses associated with polio. Some more articles that we found. Grand Tower soldier is missing in action. Private First Class James Marler missing in action. Private Vernon Welch reported missing in action in Korea. Private Welch was the nephew of Mr. and Mrs. Connie Nelson of Rockwood and was reported missing in action since July 24th of 1950. And then we see Sergeant Roy Stewart. We can only assume that it was a Sergeant Stewart that we talked about with the Red Cross, but of course not 100% sure. Sergeant Roy Stewart was wounded in action in Korea. He is now in the hospital at Busan. He was a member of the 54th Infantry Division and the son of Mrs. Anna Johnson of Rockwood. I should also say that I am by no means an expert on the Korean War, and if I mispronounce these names that are totally unfamiliar to me, I apologize. Just another glimpse of things at home. The American Legion was getting ready for their annual homecoming. Just thought it was kind of interesting to look through the different businesses that were supporting or sponsoring the homecoming and some of the specials they offered. Again, just to give you a glimpse of what it was like here in Chester while several of our young men were serving in Korea. It's in August of 1950, we see an article about Ensign George Holloman standing beside the fast F-9F jet fighter that he now pilots. This jet plane is known as the Panther. Holloman is stationed aboard the USS Philippine Sea, I think it says, a carrier, and is now seeing duty in the Korean area. Unfortunately, as we look into the veterans book, we learn that Lieutenant Commander George Holloman, jet fighter, I should say, he was flying, was lost at sea off the coast of Japan in 1961. So 11 years after this picture was taken, he had become a lieutenant commander, and he perished, as I said, when his plane was lost at sea. Into September, we see some more headlines from the front page of the paper. They're trying to decide where to build the new grade school here in Chester, so that made some of the headlines. And Private First Class Howard Brandt was listed as wounded in action on the Korean War front. Private Brandt was the son of Mr. and Mrs. Claude E. Brandt of Chester. The telegram they received did not state the seriousness of his wounds. Another man listed as wounded in action in Korea was Sergeant Arthur B. Smith of Chester. He was wounded on the Korean War front, and sadly, we learn more about Sergeant Smith on the next slide, where we learned he was actually killed in action. Some other headlines from that time were Private First Class Eugene Bockhorn of Campbell Hill was killed in action. And while we're learning tragic news, we still learn of more young men from our county being called to service and heading off to war. Now, Sergeant Arthur Smith, at the time of his passing, his dad, also Arthur Smith, worked at the Illinois Security Hospital, which we now know, of course, is Chester Mental Health Center. And at that time, they had a weekly newsletter that they shared information about the facility with one another. And there's a tribute to Sergeant Smith on the front page of that newsletter, and I'll read some of that. Arthur, an infantry sergeant, was killed in action in North Korea. This resulted from his combat in the heroic battle of his unit in holding back the Chinese communists, enabling the majority of our troops to make a safer withdrawal. Sergeant Smith had earlier been wounded in action, hospitalized in Japan, and then returned to duty again on the 18th of November. He was killed just 8 days later. This, plus the fact that he was the only son and the youngest child, renders the family's loss too great for the expression of appropriate condolences. He cooperated fully in the treatment of his injuries in Japan, knowing full well that upon his recovery, he would be returned to dangerous action in North Korea. This by itself confirms the fact that he was exceptionally an outstanding soldier. While on furlough this summer, Sergeant Smith visited the hospital with his father, Mr. Arthur Smith, who is a charge officer on our center ward, and himself a veteran of both world wars. All who met Sergeant Smith noted the spirit of a top-notch American soldier with habits, morals, and character far above reproach. He could have easily been formally rated as an ideal American boy. Deserving of the nation's highest honors, he now rests among the honored dead. I'd like to thank Brenda Conchardo for sharing this information with us. We conclude 1950, though, with our wishing everyone a happy new year. And I'm sure that the Atchisons were happy to receive word that their son was safe. You can see in the article to the left, Lieutenant Thomas Atchison, son of Mr. and Mrs. O.E. Atchison of Chester, recently wrote his parents while waiting evacuation from Hunam in Korea. He told them that he was quite safe and that he is a member of the 3rd Division Rear Guard. He helped rescue Marines trapped in the Chosin Reservoir area. And another young man sent a letter home in December, and his parents too knew that he was doing okay. Letter from Sergeant Harold Versman, son of Mr. and Mrs. Arthur Versman, indicated the boys in Korea are having a rough time of it. In the letter recently received by his parents and dated December 13th, he assures his mother and father that he is fine, only a bit frozen. He mentioned that he was among the troops that were trapped since November 28th, and of the 240 soldiers with him, there were 5 who were able to march out, with the rest either wounded, missing, or killed. Goes on to talk a little bit more about the trying times he experienced the end of November and early December of 1950. Moving on to 1951, we can see again the headlines of some of the activities taking place here at home. Also on this particular front page, we see Private Albert Schroeder, son of Mr. and Mrs. Elvin Butch Schroeder of Chester, is now stationed in Virginia. Edgar Wilson of Chester, son of Mr. and Mrs. Albert Wilson, is also in service in California, I believe it says. And it talks more about more young men inducted into the armed forces. And a little bit later in the news that year, we see Private First Class Donald Hartenberger. That one's a little blurry, I'm sorry. Can't read a whole lot about that one, except that looks like he was serving in North Carolina, at least for a while. Back at home again, we're still voting about schools and the like. I know in one of the papers it talked about some of the work being done on the high school bowl. They were trying to build the concrete bleachers associated with the football bowl. And you see a pretty large picture of the Yellow Jackets basketball team getting ready to go to a regional tournament. We know that several, or at least some of these young men as shown in this picture, will be called to service in just a short time after their graduation. Small article on the bottom of this page talks about Truman Cashman, wounded in Korea. Very sad news came in March for a family in Chester. Private First Class Delmer Petrowski was killed in the Korean War. A telegram advised his parents of that he died on February 11th. He was a son of Mr. and Mrs. Herman Petrowski of Chester. The message sent to the Petrowskis only gave the bare details of the tragedy. Still more of our young men from the county are heading off to service. You can see several names listed on these articles. 9 heading to Fort Leonard Wood. 2 sons of the Tillers are heading off to service. Actually, 5 sons. It says Private Charles Tiller, now in training at Camp Breckenridge in Kentucky, is the 5th son of Mr. and Mrs. B.R. Tiller of Chester to enter service. 3 who served in World War II are James, William, and Carl, and Corporal Warren Tiller, another son of Mr. and Mrs. B.R. Tiller, is in Suwon, Korea. Private First Class Walter Meyer is now in Korea. Matthew Vaudry is now in Korea. A couple of the Shermer brothers, sons of Mr. and Mrs. John Shermer, who are members of the United States Air Corps. Paul is in Korea and was sent to Tokyo, Japan recently, and he met his brother Bertram. Another son, John Shermer, is stationed in Mississippi. Corporal Billy Stewart, son of Mrs. Bessie Stewart of Chester, is presently in the Army Field Hospital in Korea, recovering from shrapnel wounds and frozen feet received in an engagement with North Korean troops in February. You can see that a lot of these articles list the address where people can write to those who are serving. Everyone that I've noticed or paid close attention to, I guess I should say, was always an APO address that was sent to San Francisco. More sad news came in 1951 when Harry Getting was reported killed in the Far East. This slide also shows a group of men from Randolph County recently being inducted into the armed forces. Vernon Kester from Baldwin, Leonard Runge from Chester, Ray Yankee from Chester, a couple of Redbud boys, Rupert Royce from Chester, W. Knoll from Chester, and the gentleman that served as the clerk of the draft board, Henry C. Ward. Another glimpse from home, some of the ads and so forth from the papers from 1951. I guess this is when the milkman maybe still came to the door, because the advertisement says at your door or at your store. Talks about the Chester City Dairy, along with an ad from the P.N. Hirsch department store. It's fascinating to see the prices and the items of things available, not only at the grocery stores like Daniel's Food Stores, which I know was a popular grocery store at the time. Dale Hesemeyer completes Marine training and boot camp. Now, I was very fortunate to be able to personally speak with Mr. Hesemeyer just recently. He hadn't seen this article, so I was happy to give him a copy of it. When he was at boot camp he climaxed his recruit training by winning the expert medal on the rifle range when he fired a score of 222 out of a possible 250 during his weapons training. Goes on to talk a little bit more about boot camp and how that all went. You can see he enlisted in January of 1951. And when I had the opportunity to speak with Mr. Hessemeyer, my first question for him was, when did he serve in Korea?
51 to July 52.
And you were with the United States Marine Corps.
Yeah.
If you could tell me about some of your pictures, that would be great.
He was with Jack Groff. I was with him most of the time in training, but then when we got to Korea, we got separated. But anyway, he got with Jack Groff.
You were with Jack in training, is what
Well,
you?
I wasn't. He was.
Oh, he was. Okay,
Yeah.
I see.
And well, you just don't find that stuff out till later. The tanks. I wasn't in the tank outfit, but we were on patrol when we come up by them. Near as I could figure, that was the last outpost. We had no more men going towards the Sea of Japan.
Okay.
But the battleship Missouri was setting in the Sea of Japan, and they could shoot approximately 16 miles. So and if you was on the other side, you didn't want to get where a 16-inch shell could hit to you. That was South Korean Army.
I'm curious how you got the pictures. Did you carry a camera with you? I mean, were cameras readily available to you to take pictures?
Camera?
Uh-huh.
Yeah, my mother sent me an old camera.
To make sure she could get some pictures of you,
Well,
huh? That's neat.
I don't know if I asked her or not, but it was a little hard to keep it.
I bet it was.
This picture here, just we were on a patrol, and you can see the tops of all the trees is blowed out there from artillery hitting on it before. The Chinese had been run off of there by then. And this here is just a bunch of foxholes that the Chinese had. This is my outfit here, but that's a Chinese ammunition going off. They were shelling us at this time.
Oh my.
And they'd walk it in on you. You know, if you was over here, they'd drop there, 100 yards, and then and you could see back up here where they hit one, and then they moved the next round, hit our outfit. Yeah.
Is this you?
Yeah, that's me. Well, we was getting ready to go on a patrol there. And the old time Marines had them leggings yet.
Tell me a little bit about your uniform and what you were wearing on that particular picture, if you can.
Well, it's just dungarees, and got a cartridge belt with so many clips around. That's the M1 rifle. And back in the rear is a 105 howitzer. That's artillery.
So you said you sent this to your mom when you got back to the States, huh?
Yeah. It's been about 70 years ago.
We're trying to talk a little bit about what it was like here at home while you all were serving over in Korea. What do you remember about leaving?
Used to be a lot of little service stations and restaurants.
Mm-hmm.
And there was one up here as kids all hung out all the time. The big one was Shep and Stan's, Sarah's brothers.
Yeah.
But this was this little one that was right up here.
Up the road? Okay.
And, hey, you want to go along? I said, where are you going? He said, we're going up to St. Louis, join the Navy. I said, well, yeah, I'll go along. I ain't got nothing else to do.
How old were you?
17. We went up there, and instead of the the Marines got a hold of me and recruited me, and
Get to Korea. How did you get over there?
well, we went on a boat, the Pickaway.
Pickaway.
Armin Muntroy was on it. He was a sailor.
Uh-huh.
Did you know Harold Howie?
Of course I did. Mm-hmm.
Well, he's my cousin. We going over, me and Harold was laying under a lifeboat cleaning our rifle, and I seen Armin walk by.
You didn't know he was there?
I didn't know he was on. No, I just fairly well knew Armin, not too much.
Sure.
He was a good bit older, 3 or 4 years
Yeah.
older than me. And but anyway, Hattie, we called Harold Howie Hattie. Well, he went to school, and I guess they about in the same grade. So anyway, they got together and do all kinds of things in war.
Yeah.
They had an old C-47 cargo plane, and they would, late in the evening, they would fly that up and down the lines. And they had an old woman in there on a loudspeaker, and she'd cry and bawl, you know, and so they told us that was propaganda. She was going against the Chinese. She was telling them that their girlfriend was out with somebody else or their mother died.
Trying to get in their head, huh?
Yeah, and needless to say, a lot of guys said, well, we ought to shoot the damn thing down because it has more effect on me than it did Chinese.
Well, what do you remember about coming home? Have things changed much here in Randolph County when you came home?
Well, I was young and just glad to get back.
I'd really like to thank Dale Hesemeyer for sharing his story. He had a few more to tell, and I encourage you, if you have someone like Dale in your family who you haven't had the chance to record their story or share that, learn that information from them, you know, to do it as soon as you can. Thank you so much, Dale. And we're still in the 1950s here, and with the Chester Herald Tribune. This particular story talks about an article from Bob Backer, a Chester Marine. He said he's glad to be home. Serving with the United States Marines since his enlistment in 1948, he spent 10 months in Korea and has seen a lot of service. Bob was taking part in the Incheon and Wonsan amphibious landings and has seen service in various parts of the Korean front, and declares all in all that he believes the boys have had a pretty rough time of it. Backer said that although the winter in Korea was a short one, it was bitterly cold and uncomfortable beyond description. He added that the boys found it necessary to sleep on their canned rations in order to find them edible the next day, as they would freeze otherwise. Back at home, they're having trouble with the floods. 1951, July saw a common problem then and not so long ago here for us now. You can see a city dairy truck trying to get through the water down along Water Street. Some of the store windows were promoting Poppy Days. This particular store window was from the Please You shop, where Catherine Boger, owner of the shop, was known for her nice window displays. Another one of the floods, like I said, that was a problem then, as it has been several times before and since then. Getting ready to build the Chester Grade School. You can see an architect's sketch of it from August of '51. And the new gymnasium taking shape in September of '51 is the gym at St. Mary's. September also showed us the football season opens up for Chester High School. We know some of these young men will eventually be in the service. More sad news from 1951. Kenneth Bodeker, whose parents are Mr. and Mrs. Arthur Bodeker, recently received word that he lost his life on a Korean battlefield. Moving on to 1952. The front page here is from February of 52. It shows three brothers, the Shermer brothers, who have a reunion in Korea. And some of the others called to service, Private First Class Jackie Bivens. He was from Chester, son of Mr. and Mrs. Everett Bivens. He returned from a tour of the Mediterranean, and they shared his address to write to him. The center picture underneath the Herald Tribune book shows the capture of two Koreans. In the center is Private First Class Jack R. Graw of Chester. He is shown with two North Koreans he captured while standing watch one evening. Hearing them moving about, he took a machine gun, called to them in Korean to surrender, which they did, dropping their weapons as they came to him. Jack's wife, Dorothy, and son, Michael Wayne, live with his parents, Mr. and Mrs. Harold Graw, on High Street in Chester. And then we also see that Corporal Danny James from the United States Marine Corps was now being sent to San Francisco for service. Some more news articles about some of our young men serving in the armed forces. Brothers Floyd and Reynold Egemeyer. Norbert Stump completes basic training. The Hurdy brothers are completing basic airman courses at Lackland Air Force Base. Tony Jashinsky, Roger Schrader, and Charles Tiller, all Chester boys, recently met up in Korea. Roger wrote to tell of this meeting and sent pictures taken with Charles's camera. Again, this is 1952 in Korea. Lieutenant Harry E. Montroy of Evansville recently completed Jump Master course at Fort Benning, Georgia. I happen to know that today is the 90th birthday of Harry Montroy, so sure like to take the opportunity to wish him a very happy birthday. The final picture on the slide is of Private First Class James Graw. Jimmy is my husband's uncle, and he would like to receive letters from his friends, and of course it says his address in California, and his daughter Kathy sent us some information about Jimmy's service in Korea. Jimmy was an Army veteran who served with the 633rd group. I'll let you read all those initials because I'm not exactly sure what they all mean. In Korea, he received the Korean Service Medal with 3 Bronze Stars and the National Defense Service Medal and the United Nations Service Medal. Kathy writes that Jimmy had several pictures of the USO show that he attended while he was there, and can only assume that's what the picture is on the screen. It's nice to know that there was a little bit of relief from all the seriousness of war by kind people like Bob Hope and taking the shows on the road. Kathy writes that he was had normal artillery responsibilities, and that he also worked on vehicle mechanics and did some heavy equipment operating while he was there as well. She said he had a lot of pictures of the stone that marked the 38th parallel. That's the center picture. Of course, the 38th parallel we know marks the line that divides North and South Korea. Jimmy didn't share much about his stories from Korea while he was alive. It wasn't until very late in his life that he actually talked a little bit more about his service. Thanks, Kathy, for sharing these memories with us. At home, they're having troubles at Menard. There's a pretty big riot, over 600 men in the East Cell House as riot breaks out. You can see some of those headlines from September of 1952. Sergeant McDonough is killed in Korea. He's a member of the National Guard. A telegram received by family Monday, December 8th, gave news of the death of Sergeant Gene McDonough of Ellis Grove, a member of the Illinois National Guard. He was the husband of the former Margaret Wittenbrink of Chester, daughter of Mr. and Mrs. Brady Wittenbrink, who lost their son George in World War II. He had 2 young daughters at the time, Donna only 2 and Deborah just 8 months. Here we are to 1953 and young men being called into service. You can see the different names across the big article to the left of the screen. Calvin Brewer, 2 Rickenberg boys, Ronald Hografey, Marvin Vickers, Roland Wagner was called into service, as well as Jackie Lindsay. And Kenneth B. Lutz completed the course of instruction of Air Training Command, specializing in air operations. We know that Kenny eventually served in Korea, and we learned sadly that he passed this week. So our sincere condolences to the Lutz family. Moving on, Melvin Steve of Chester has been charged the duty of guarding communist prisoners of war. He was awarded a combat badge in October of '52 for the battle, participating in the Battle of Heartbreak Ridge. Anthony Potler, while it was in Korea, met Adlai Stevenson. Of course, we know that Adlai Stevenson was, I think I'm pronouncing that right, Adlai Stevenson was a presidential candidate. He visited the soldiers in Korea. 2 more local men are called to service, Clifford Curtis and Donald Johnny of Chester. I know Don and many of his brothers are listed in the Veterans Book. I think most of them served their country either in World War II or in Korea. And sadly, the Gold Star mothers of these moms, of course, lost sons in service. They are left to right, Mrs. Herman Petrowski, Mrs. Teresa Eggemeyer, Mrs. Linda Beisner, and Mrs. Frida Koopman. I put this in because it was, just as you look through these papers, it's fascinating to know what's going on in Chester. And so 70 years ago, well, not quite 70 years because this is from 1953. But this article caught my eye because it said sidewalk supervisors had a field day in Chester on Thursday, June 4th, when Keeney Moving Company of Pickneyville moved a house from the 100th block of Stacy Street to 422 West Holmes. The house was being moved to make way for a new Dairy Queen, which would be opening later in the year. July 17th. We're getting close to the official end of the war. We can see different servicemen from our community were honored for heroism in the Korean War. Corporal Raymond Keeker, husband of the former Mary Rose Sake of Chester, was awarded a Bronze Star Medal for heroic achievement in Korea. And Roger Dravis also received a bronze star, I should say, for brave service in Korea. So the wars come to a close. We learn that Charles Mines from Sparta were celebrating because in addition to them having birthdays, they learned that their son had been released from a communist prison camp. It was certainly a joyous time for them. The papers at that time really didn't mark the beginning or the ending of the Korean War. The information we found was just what you saw, pictures and information about individual servicemen from our area. So it was an interesting adventure going through the newspapers from those years. Like I said earlier, we received information from different family members of people who served. Patty Dement sent these pictures of her dad, Bob Dement. He was a former Chester resident and served in Korea from January 1951 until October 1951 with the 1st Cavalry Division, 8th Regiment, 3rd Battalion, Company D. Bob Dement. I'd like to thank his daughter for sharing these images. I'd like to thank Janet Lawhead for sending these photos of her dad, Corporal Dean Lawhead. He served in the United States Army from 1950 to 1953. According to the Veterans Book, in 1951, Dean took part in Operation Little Switch and Operation Big Switch. At the end, when the armistice was signed, he came home and forgot about Korea. Thanks, Janet, for sharing these images. Sherman Martin. Sherman didn't grow up in Chester, but he was a teacher, a longtime teacher here at the high school in Chester. And his son, Bob Martin, kindly shared Sherman's stories with me over the phone. And I'm going to play some of that conversation for you now.
Dad enlisted in the United States Marine August 4th, 1949. He was 17 years old. 12th of 1950, he was shipped out to Pusan, P-U-S-A-N, South Korea. When the Marines, he was with the 1st Marine Division, 5th Marine Regiment. When they arrived in Pusan on August 2nd, they began fighting the North Koreans. During their fight, some of all the higher ups there, his commanders and that, found out they didn't have enough radio operators. So Dad's sergeant volunteered him to be a radio operator, which back then they called him a field operator. And another word for that was forward observer. So basically he's out in front of the troops, like as a scout, scouting on the enemy and then calling in artillery fire on top of them. That was his job. Okay, around September 10th to the 12th, 1950, the 1st Marine Division loaded up on what's called Higgin boats, and they're just like a landing craft for the troops. And they proceeded to the East Coast to the South Korean city of Incheon, I-N-C-H-O-N. And on September 15th, they attacked the North Korean army, which had filtered into South Korea and had taken the Incheon and Seoul, Korea, by the way. After taking Incheon, they marched over to Seoul, took Seoul back, and by October 7th of 1950, the Incheon and Seoul campaign was over. days later, they landed at Wonsan, North Korea, which is Wonsan. There were 80,000 North Korean troops there, which the Marines drove out and secured the port. Wonsan was pretty important to North Korea at the time because they had airports and their petroleum refineries were there also. This battle kind of lasted until the 25th of October. On October 29th, they marched from Wonsan, Korea to Hungnam, Korea, North Korea. Hungan. This was the beginning of the Chosin Reservoir campaign, which I guess is one of the reasons why everybody wanted to talk to him, about what he did in the service, because they knew he went to the Chosin, which was also known as the Frozen Chosin. On November 15th, the division reached Hagari, which is on the tip of the Chosin Reservoir. The weather had went from fall to winter in a matter of days with bitter cold temperatures. As a matter of fact, the Siberian front had come through and the temperature was dropping all the time. The Marines left another regiment at Hagari because Hagari was important because of an airport and supplies could be flown in to these regiments that they were leaving as they were going on up. The only thing they didn't count on was the weather. That was kind of the downfall of the campaign. Finally, on December 14th, with supplies running low and everything, I believe it was Major General Smith decided that they're going to leave the reservoir. They're going to go back the way they came. And when they did, they'd have to fight through the Chinese, and actually the Chinese followed them all the way down that trail. And that was like a 75-mile trail that this was from Hungnam to Udine, was 75 miles, and the Chinese followed them all the way. Nephew that's in the Air Force, who was in the Air Force, he's out of the Air Force now, but he was in the Air Force. And usually Dad don't like talking about this, but he told my nephew when they come back from the Chosin, and they got within like 20 miles, they got overran by the Chinese again. And it was so bad, they didn't think they was going to make it. Dad was on the radio calling for help, and someone finally answered him. He was dialing his radio with different frequencies, and someone answered him. And the guy asked him what his mission, who he was, and all this to verify everything. And Dad says, "Well, I can't tell you that. It's secret." He says, "But I'll give you my name and serial number. Look it up. You'll find out I'm legit." And about 5 minutes later, this guy come back, asked him, he says, "What coordinates you want us to fire at?" Well, next thing you know, all heck broke loose, and they just bombs exploding every which way, all around them, just really eliminating the Chinese threat. Well, come to find out later on, Dad found out who he was talking to. It was radio men on the USS Missouri. And Missouri had 2 other battleships with it there at one of the harbors there, which was close to that Hungnam. And they just opened up on him. During his time, the decorations he received was the Korean Service Ribbon, Presidential Unit Citation, Purple Heart, and a Good Conduct Medal.
Thank you so much, Bob, for sharing your dad's story. Patsy Olau offered to let us display her husband Glenn's uniforms from the 1950s. Glenn served in the 1950s in France. Unfortunately, because of all the COVID closings and so forth, we are unable to share things or display things like this in the library at this time. But I certainly would like to thank Patsy and Sharon for sending the photos of Glenn's service and his uniforms and some of the things that they've collected and kept from when he served in the 1950s. I'd like to thank Gail and Tom O'Connor for sending the photo of Tom's brother, James R. O'Connor. He was in Seoul, Korea. in the mid 1960s. And last, but certainly not least, would like to talk a little bit about Lisa's dad, Delbert Sterneman. He served in the United States Army in Korea from 1958, or in Korea from 58 and 59. Lisa, can you tell us a little bit about what you recall about your dad's sharing memories about his service in Korea and some of the items that you were able to keep in your family from that time?
Absolutely. The picture there is my dad, and he is standing in front of one of the big trucks, and that was his primary job in Korea. He was a mechanic. But it's interesting to note, Dad was probably 23 in this picture. He was drafted when he was 22. Now, he was in during peacetime, but young men in our area were being drafted up until their early 20s to still go overseas. So I thought that was kind of interesting.
I like his note to your mom about how the ship doesn't look so bad on paper, but it wasn't so good. This is a complete little booklet that has different parts of the ship. And I believe this was the last page where he wrote a note to your mom.
Yes, he said going over was horrible. They ran into so many storms, and he said if they weren't in bed sick, they were hanging over the edge of the ship very sick.
Oh,
But he
Mom.
said the trip home was just wonderful, and I think we all can relate to that. If we're going to the unknown, it's bad, and when you come home, it's always great.
What about these pictures?
These are pictures of my dad. This little guy with him, his name was Jimmy, and he was their houseboy. He was an orphan over there, and they kind of took him under their wing, and he did odd jobs for him. He would do their laundry and different things, and they would pay him so this little boy could basically survive. And there's a picture of Jimmy and his dog, and I didn't think that was a big deal, and Dad said it was a very big deal because the Korean people over there were so hungry and so poor that you didn't have pets, you had food. So for them to have this little dog for Jimmy was a big deal. The picture with Dad with his arm around him, I don't know if you can read Dad's handwriting, but he's asking Mom if he should bring him home. And the few times Dad's talked about Korea, Jimmy's always been part of it. He loved that little boy, and if he possibly could have, that little boy would have somehow been my brother. Dad would have loved to have brought him home with him. Okay, if anyone knew my father back in the day, you know my dad lived and breathed ball. So this is a picture of them as the Incheon champs in 1959. And if you look real close, my dad's on the left-hand side with his foot kind of resting on the bench. And you can see that his hand is bandaged. He had broken his thumb pretty bad. He compared it to the break Molina had several years ago. So he was in the hospital. He had just had surgery, and his sergeant came the day after surgery. And Dad said there was a very heated discussion between his sergeant and his doctor. The sergeant was trying to get my dad released, and the doctor was like, this man's going absolutely nowhere. He's staying here for several days. And the sergeant pretty well lost it and said, this man's leaving today. We've got a ball game to play, and I need him. As you can see, Dad left that day with his sergeant against doctor's orders, and they ended up being the champs. So kudos, Dad. Good for you. The next one is just a picture of Dad and one of his friends standing in front of one of their signs, and it says, we move the world. And yes, Dad, you move my world. This is a picture. It shows the different seasons. You can see the one with my dad all bundled up. I remember him saying how bitter, bitter cold it was over there, and just ungodly amount of snow they endured. And then the next picture, you can see his hand still bandaged because he was hurt for quite a while. They're laying outside, and a lot of times he said they would even sleep outside. The barracks were so unbearable hot, and at times they would just pour ice on top of each other just to stay cool because it was one extreme or the other over there. And this is hand painted on silk, a picture of my mom that my dad had made in Korea and sent home to her.
Thanks so much, Lisa, for sharing stories about your dad and your family. It's an amazing likeness of your mom. And this is pretty large, if I remember correctly, right? This is a pretty big scarf.
I'd say almost close to 3 feet by 3 feet. We never had it displayed at home. It was, as you can tell, folded up in a drawer, but I rescued it.
We're doing this presentation today in loving memory of Delbert Sterneman, who passed away in June of last year. We'd like to thank everyone who submitted information. And again, if we weren't able to tell your story this evening, please share it on our Facebook post or comments. And most of all, please share it with your family. Thanks so much for joining us tonight.